3 hours. That is how long hypersonic missiles rained onto central Israel in a single unbroken assault. Not a salvo, not a burst. 3 continuous hours of precision-guided munitions arriving at velocities that make interception a problem of physics, not capability. Fateh ballistic missiles hitting Mach 15 on re-entry, 15 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, an interceptor has approximately 4 seconds to acquire, track, calculate a firing solution, launch, and connect with a target that is descending at over 5 kilometers per second. Khorramshahr warheads carrying over 1,500 kilograms of explosives each. That is 3,300 pounds of high explosive per missile, enough to destroy a city block, enough to crater a runway, enough to collapse a hardened shelter. And cluster munitions, warheads engineered to open at altitude and scatter dozens of bomblets across a radius of 10 kilometers before a single interceptor could acquire them. 24 independent submunitions, each on its own trajectory, each too small and too numerous for a system designed to track a single re-entry vehicle. Arrow fired, David Sling fired, Iron Dome fired, all of them. The most sophisticated, most expensive, most battle-tested missile defense architecture ever assembled by any nation in human history. All of it overwhelmed. This was Wave 37 of Operation True Promise 4, the longest wave, the heaviest wave, the most technically sophisticated strike Iran has launched since this war began. And 4 days before it happened, 4 days, the White House stood in front of cameras and told the world that 90% of Iran's threat had been eliminated. Let that sink in. 90% eliminated. On March 6th, Wave 37 arrived on March 10th. 3 hours of hypersonic missiles, cluster munitions, and overlapping attack waves. 4 days after 90% was supposed to be gone. That 4-day gap is not a communications problem. It is not a media failure. It is not a rounding error in a complex operational assessment. It is the distance between the war that was being described and the war that was actually being fought. And that distance has consequences for Israel, for the United States, for the global economy, and for every assumption the Western world has made about how missile defense works, how regional conflicts stay contained, and how much damage a sanctions-constrained nation can actually inflict against the most advanced military technology on Earth. What you are about to hear is not what your newsfeed is showing you. In this breakdown, I'm going to show you 3 things that change everything about how you understand this conflict. First, I'm going to show you exactly why Iron Dome failed, at a physics level. Not because it was outnumbered, because it was built on a design assumption that cluster munitions shatter entirely, an architectural vulnerability that no interceptor system in the world is designed to solve. Second, I'm going to walk you through Iran's sequencing strategy, step by step, phase by phase. A 3-phase military doctrine that was executing in plain sight while Western analysts were busy counting launch numbers and declaring victory based on the wrong data. Third, I'm going to connect this directly to your wallet, your energy bills, your grocery prices, the supply chains that move the goods you buy every single day. Because what happened on March 10th is not a regional firefight that stays contained inside a map. The economic shockwaves are already moving through oil markets, shipping routes, and defense budgets in ways that will reach ordinary people far outside the Middle East. Subscribe to join the community, leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going, and share this video because the gap between what you're being told and what actually happened is wider right now than at any point since this conflict began. And closing that gap starts with understanding Wave 37. Let me start with what is confirmed, not claimed, not speculated, not inferred from social media footage or anonymous sources. Confirmed by the institutions that have every political reason to minimize what happened. On March 10th, 2026, the Israeli Defense Forces held a formal press briefing. And in that briefing, the IDF disclosed something that reframes this entire war. Approximately 50% of all ballistic missiles launched by Iran at Israel since February 28th carried cluster bomb warheads. Not conventional unitary warheads, single explosions designed to destroy a single target. Cluster munitions, weapons specifically engineered to defeat the mathematical logic of missile defense systems. 50%, half of all incoming missiles, carrying warheads that multiply into dozens of independent threats before reaching the ground. The IDF stated directly that Iran has been firing cluster-armed missiles at Israel almost every single day since this conflict began. Every day, for weeks, and the public was not told. The daily briefings showed launch counts and interception rates and damage assessments. But the critical detail, that half the incoming missiles were carrying warheads specifically designed to defeat the interception system, was not publicly disclosed until Wave 37 made it impossible to withhold. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies published a confirming analysis on March 11th. Their assessment was explicit. With Iran's launcher fleet being degraded by Israeli and American strikes, the deliberate shift to cluster warheads is a calculated adaptation designed to extract maximum damage from every individual missile that successfully penetrates the defense envelope. Read that sentence carefully. Every word was chosen by analysts who understand what they're describing. This is not desperation. A desperate military fires what it has, randomly, hoping something gets through. This is optimization, a deliberate, calculated, doctrinally informed decision to shift warhead configuration in response to observed defensive performance. Iran watched how the interceptors worked, identified the vulnerability, and redesigned its warhead mix to exploit it. That is not the behavior of a degraded, 90% eliminated threat. That is the behavior of a military that is adapting faster than the defense can respond. Now move to the American side of the ledger. The New York Times published a satellite imagery analysis on March 11th, cross-referenced against verified video footage and official statements. That analysis identified at least 17 American military and allied facilities damaged by Iranian strikes across the Gulf region. 11 of those are United States military installations. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait, Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. These are not peripheral installations on the edge of the conflict. These are the command, logistics, and coordination hubs that the entire American military presence in the Gulf region depends on. Al Udeid is the Combined Air Operations Center, the facility that coordinates every American air operation across the Middle East. Ali Al Salem is a primary logistics hub. The Fifth Fleet headquarters commands American naval operations across the Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Red Sea. Several of these facilities were struck more than once. Satellite imagery captured structural damage immediately adjacent to positions where American THAAD and TPY-2 radar systems were deployed near Al Dhafra in the United Arab Emirates. The TPY-2 radar is not just another piece of equipment. It is the tracking backbone of the THAAD missile defense system. It is the sensor that detects incoming ballistic missiles, calculates their trajectory, and provides the targeting data that interceptor missiles need to execute an interception. Damage to those radar support structures and communications nodes doesn't just damage a building. It degrades the eyes of the entire defense network. Without functioning radar, interceptor missiles cannot accurately calculate firing solutions. The interception mathematics collapses at the source. And the estimated damage? The Fifth Fleet headquarters alone, approximately 200 million lunts. At Ali Al Salem, at least 6 structures tied to satellite communications infrastructure were destroyed or severely damaged. And on the ground inside Israel, the human cost. The Alma Research and Education Center's verified daily casualty report as of March 10th, 14 civilians killed, 2,339 injured. More than 3,000 residents displaced by direct missile impacts and falling interception debris. The single deadliest event, the March 1st strike on Beit Shemesh. An Iranian ballistic missile penetrated a communal bomb shelter built beneath a synagogue. 9 people killed. 3 of them were teenage siblings. The IDF confirmed that 2 interceptors had been fired at that missile. Both failed. 2 interceptors. Both failed. 9 people dead in a shelter that was supposed to protect them. That is not a statistic. That is the ground truth of what missile defense limitations look like in human terms. Now we go deeper. Because the data points I just gave you are not isolated events. They are symptoms of 3 interconnected failures that nobody in official channels wants to discuss in the same breath. A physics failure, a strategic failure, and an intelligence failure. When you see all 3 together, the picture that emerges is fundamentally different from anything you are being shown on your news feed. Layer 1. The physics failure. Every missile defense system ever built, every one, from the most basic to the most advanced, operates on a binary assumption. There is one warhead. It follows a calculable arc. You fire an interceptor. You either hit it or you miss it. Hit equals safe. Miss equals damage. That is the entire mathematical foundation of Arrow, David's Sling, and Iron Dome. One threat, one solution, binary outcome. Cluster munitions annihilate that logic entirely. Here is the mechanism. And once you understand it, you understand why no amount of additional interceptors solves the problem. A cluster warhead does not detonate as a single explosion. It is engineered to open at altitude, typically between 1,000 and 3,000 meters above the target area, and release between 20 and 24 submunitions. Each submunition carries several kilograms of high explosives. They scatter across a dispersal radius of up to 5 kilometers, each one on a slightly different trajectory, each one too small and too numerous for a system designed to track a single re-entry vehicle to engage individually. The warhead doesn't arrive as one threat. It arrives as 24 simultaneous threats, each falling independently, each requiring its own interception. If the interceptor reaches the missile before the warhead separates, before the casing opens and the submunitions deploy, the threat is contained. One kill, all submunitions destroyed. But these weapons are specifically engineered to separate at altitude outside the optimal intercept window. The timing is calculated. The altitude of separation is calibrated against known interception profiles. Iran knows when Arrow fires, knows when David's Sling fires, knows the engagement altitude for each system, and designs the separation point to occur after. The primary interception window has passed, and here's the detail that almost never gets reported, the detail that makes this a physics problem rather than an engineering problem. Even when an interceptor successfully destroys a cluster-armed missile, a confirmed kill, a direct hit, the force of the detonation can rupture the warhead casing and scatter the bomblets outward anyway. The defense system scores a kill. The submunitions still reach the ground. This is not a flaw in Israeli execution. Israeli missile defense operators are among the most skilled and experienced in the world. This is a fundamental architectural vulnerability that no currently deployed interceptor system, anywhere, in any country, is designed to solve. Iran identified that vulnerability, studied it, understood it at the engineering level, and built its entire warhead strategy around it. 50% cluster munitions is not a coincidence. It is not a field expedient. It is a doctrine, a deliberate warhead allocation strategy designed to ensure that even successful interceptions produce ground-level damage. The implications extend far beyond this specific conflict, because every nation that relies on missile defense, the United States, Japan, South Korea, NATO members with Patriot and THAAD deployments, faces the same architectural vulnerability. The physics don't change because the geography changes. Cluster-armed ballistic missiles defeat the mathematical logic of missile defense, not by overwhelming it with numbers, by making the concept of a successful interception meaningless. Layer 2, the sequencing strategy. Now zoom out from the individual weapon. Look at the campaign architecture across the full timeline, because when you examine the pattern of Iranian operations from day 1 through wave 37, a 3-phase operational sequence becomes visible, a sequence that was executing in plain sight the entire time. While Western analysts were busy counting launch numbers and calling the declining count a victory, Phase 1 ran from the opening days through approximately day 6. Iran fired in volume, 90 launches on day 1, 65 on day 2, 25 on day 3. The numbers declined. The trend line pointed down. The official narrative watched that declining number and declared progress. Analysts credited joint suppression operations with eliminating up to 75% of Iran's operational launcher fleet. The White House presented the falling launch rate as proof the campaign was working. Briefings showed graphs with bars getting shorter. The visual said, "We're winning." But volume was never the objective of Phase 1. Saturation was. Iran was not trying to maximize damage in the opening waves. It was probing. Stress testing every layer of the defense network simultaneously, not to destroy, to observe, to identify which systems were slowest to respond, which radar bands were most congested, which intercept corridors were most predictable, which communications links were most vulnerable. Phase 1 was reconnaissance disguised as bombardment. The declining launch count wasn't a sign of degraded capability. It was a sign that the reconnaissance was complete. Iran had gathered what it needed. It knew where the blind spots were. It knew where the seams were. It knew what worked and what didn't. And it moved to Phase 2. Phase 2 was systematic decapitation of the detection infrastructure. The Hatzor satellite communications relay south of Tel Aviv struck twice. This relay coordinates data flow between radar installations and interceptor batteries. Damage it, and the defense network doesn't go blind. It goes incoherent. Individual systems can still detect threats, but they can't share data fast enough to generate coordinated interception. THAAD and TPY-2 radar support structures damaged across the Gulf region. 11 United States military installations struck. The communications and tracking architecture that coordinates ballistic missile defense across the entire theater methodically degraded. While the Western press was still reporting on launch count reductions, while analysts were still congratulating themselves on the declining graph, while the White House was telling the world that 90% of the threat was eliminated, the threat wasn't being eliminated. The defense was being eliminated systematically, precisely, in the correct order. Radars first, communications second, then the heavy warheads arrive into an environment that can no longer see them coming or coordinate a coherent response. Phase 3 was Wave 37, 3 continuous hours. Fateh hypersonic missiles, Khorramshahr ballistic missiles with cluster warheads, 5 distinct missile systems fired in overlapping waves across a single operational period, each one calibrated to stress a different layer of what remained of the defense network. Not into the robust, fully operational system that existed on day 1, into the degraded, partially blinded architecture that phases 1 and 2 had spent weeks methodically dismantling. This is the sequencing. This is the doctrine. This is what was happening while the graphs were going down and the briefings were declaring progress. Phase 1, probe the defense. Phase 2, blind the defense. Phase 3, strike into the darkness. Intelligence analysts are now examining whether this sequencing reflects a deliberate adoption of what military theorists call a reconnaissance strike complex, a doctrine traditionally associated with advanced state militaries, with peer competitors like Russia and China, not with a sanctions-constrained regional power operating under decades of export controls and international isolation. If that assessment holds, it represents a significant evolution in Iranian operational doctrine, an evolution that was either missed or underestimated by Western intelligence prior to this conflict. Layer 3, the intelligence failure. This brings us to the most consequential admission of this entire war. And it did not come from a whistleblower. It did not come from a leaked document. It came from the New York Times, sourced to senior United States defense officials, published in plain language on March 11th. Iran's ability to damage United States facilities across the Gulf region defied expectations inside the Trump administration. Parse that sentence carefully, because defied expectations is not neutral bureaucratic language. It is the most restrained possible way of saying that the pre-war intelligence assessment was wrong. Wrong in its fundamental assumptions about what Iran could reach, what Iran could damage, what Iran had already prepared to execute. The planning assumptions, the assumptions on which the entire operational strategy was built, were constructed on a model of Iranian capability that did not match the Iranian capability that actually showed up on the battlefield. That mismatch is not an intelligence gap. It is an intelligence failure, the kind that produces consequences that compound across every level of strategy, from tactical engagement to grand strategic positioning. And the Pentagon confirmed it does not have a complete picture of how many Iranian launchers remain operational after weeks of strikes, after thousands of munitions expended, after repeated official declarations of launcher fleet destruction reaching 80 to 90%. The institution responsible for targeting those launchers admitted it cannot fully account for what is left. The White House said 90% on March 6th. Wave 37 arrived on March 10th. That gap is not a communications lag. It is the distance between a narrative and a reality that can no longer coexist. Now, here is where this stops being a foreign policy story and starts being your story. Because the decisions made in Tehran, Washington, and Tel Aviv over the past 10 days are moving through systems that touch every person watching this video. 3 chains of consequence, each one already in motion, each one connecting a missile strike in the Middle East to the price you pay for gas, for groceries, for goods that move on ships through waters that are no longer safe. Chain 1, the Strait of Hormuz and your energy costs. 20% of all global oil supply transits the Strait of Hormuz. Not 20% of Middle Eastern oil, 20% of the entire world's daily petroleum flow, moving through a waterway that is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. On March 10th, the United States military destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near that strait. 16. That operation was not a patrol. It was a preemptive strike triggered by intelligence indicating Iran had already begun preparing to deploy naval mines across the choke point. Iran was not threatening to close the strait. Iran was in the process of closing the strait. The interdiction stopped the operation. This time, Maersk and multiple major international shipping firms have already suspended or rerouted key sailings through the region. Marine insurance premiums for Gulf transit have spiked. Every additional kilometer those vessels travel on alternative routes adds cost. That cost does not disappear. It moves forward through the supply chain, from the shipping company to the importer, from the importer to the distributor, from the distributor to the retailer, from the retailer to the price tag sitting on the shelf in front of you. If the strait closes for even 72 hours, 3 days, energy markets will react within hours, not days. Oil futures will spike, gas prices will follow, and energy price shocks do not stay inside energy markets. They accelerate inflation across every sector that moves, manufactures, or refrigerates anything, which is every sector of every economy on Earth. Chain 2, the arsenal depletion problem. Every Arrow 3 interceptor costs approximately $3 million per unit. Every time Israel fires a salvo of 2 interceptors at a single incoming missile, that is $6 million expended in approximately 90 seconds. Wave 37 lasted 3 hours. Multiply that across weeks of sustained exchanges, and you are looking at interceptor expenditure rates that are straining allied stockpiles in ways that defense ministries are not publicly quantifying. The United States is actively resupplying Israeli air defense inventories. That resupply draws from the same production lines and the same stockpiles that support American commitments elsewhere, in Europe, in the Pacific, in every theater where American deterrence depends on having interceptors available. The question being asked in certain defense circles, quietly, in classified briefings, in language carefully chosen to avoid public alarm, is pointed. If a second crisis erupts near Taiwan while interceptor stockpiles are being drawn down to sustain operations in the Middle East, what does the response calculus look like? This is not speculation. This is the standard logistical arithmetic of running simultaneous deterrence commitments with finite industrial production capacity. American interceptor production runs at a specific rate. Consumption in this conflict runs at a rate that exceeds that production capacity. The delta, the gap between what's being used and what's being made, is widening. And that gap has a direct line to defense budget allocations, to procurement contracts, and ultimately to the tax base that funds all of it, which means it has a direct line to you. Chain 3, the cluster munitions precedent. More than 100 countries have signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, banning these weapons specifically because of their indiscriminate nature and the unexploded ordnance they leave embedded in civilian environments for years after a conflict ends. Iran has not signed, Israel has not signed, the United States has not signed. Iran just demonstrated, at scale, in a live, high-visibility conflict watched by every military procurement office on the planet, that cluster-armed ballistic missiles are an effective tool for defeating the most sophisticated missile defense architecture in the world. That demonstration was not academic. It was empirical. It produced measurable results. It proved that cluster warheads increase damage output, even against systems that achieve high interception rates. It proved that the mathematical logic of missile defense can be defeated by warhead design rather than by launch volume. Every military with a ballistic missile program, and there are dozens, watched that demonstration. and the procurement discussions that follow will reflect what they learned. If this pattern holds, if cluster warheads become a standard ballistic missile configuration in regional conflicts, the humanitarian consequences extend decades beyond the conflict itself. Unexploded submunitions remain in the ground, in fields where farmers work, in neighborhoods where children play, for years, for decades, killing and maiming long after the war ends. The clearance organizations, the medical systems, the humanitarian infrastructure that deals with unexploded ordnance in post-conflict environments. None of it is scaled for a world where cluster-armed ballistic missiles become routine. The precedent is set on March 10th, 2026, in Wave 37. The consequences of that precedent will outlast every politician and every general involved in this conflict. Let me give you 3 scenarios for what happens next, because Wave 37 is not the end. It is a data point on a trajectory, and the trajectory has not changed direction. Scenario 1, the defense adapts. Israeli and American engineers accelerate development of counter-cluster interception capability, modified interceptors designed to engage warheads before the separation altitude, AI-enhanced tracking systems that can simultaneously engage multiple submunitions, directed energy weapons, lasers, that can sweep across a dispersal pattern faster than kinetic interceptors. These technologies exist in various stages of development. Some are years from deployment. But the urgency created by Wave 37 could accelerate timelines, the way wartime necessity always accelerates technology development. In this scenario, the defense catches up, not immediately, not perfectly, but enough that the cluster warhead advantage diminishes over time. The conflict settles into a technological arms race, warhead designers versus interceptor engineers, that favors the side with greater industrial and technological depth. That side is the US-Israeli alliance, over time. But over time means months or years, and in the interim, the vulnerability remains. Scenario 2, Iran escalates the sequencing. Wave 37 was phase 3 of the first cycle. What if the doctrine calls for multiple cycles? Phase 1 probed the defense. Phase 2 blinded it. Phase 3 struck into the degraded architecture. The defense is now further degraded than it was before Wave 37, which means Wave 38 faces an even weaker defense than Wave 37 did, and Wave 39 faces weaker still. If Iran maintains its launcher capability, and the Pentagon has admitted it cannot account for all remaining launchers, each subsequent wave arrives into a progressively more degraded defensive environment. The sequencing repeats. The damage compounds. The interception rate declines, not because the interceptors are failing, but because the system that coordinates them is being systematically dismantled. In this scenario, the defense doesn't fail in a single dramatic moment. It erodes, wave by wave, layer by layer, until the interception rate drops below the threshold where civilian protection is meaningful. And the political consequences of that erosion force decisions, about ceasefire, about negotiation, about the limits of what air defense can actually guarantee, that nobody wants to make. I'm watching 3 things going forward: whether the interceptor consumption rate exceeds the production replacement rate, and by how much. Because the gap between consumption and production is the gap between deterrence and depletion. And depletion in the Middle East has consequences in the Pacific that nobody is discussing publicly, but everyone in the defense establishment is calculating privately. Whether Iran demonstrates the ability to execute another Phase 3 strike, another Wave 37 scale operation within the coming weeks. Because if Iran can sustain operations at that intensity after weeks of suppression strikes, the 90% degradation claim is not just wrong. It is dangerously wrong. And every operational plan built on that claim needs to be rebuilt from scratch.